What more is there for us to do on this head in terms of the cranial portion? Well, let's move it off to the side. The next things that we've got to do start to define the mastoid process. So I want to have a clear sense of how this thing operates, how it's relating, just some of the basic elements of the occipital bone. We don't need to go into too much detail. It's not really all that important. But we do need to know roughly where the halfway point is. So we're going to say halfway point is roughly right there. Yeah. That means that the hole for the ear is going to be right there. The temporal bone is going to reroute this cheekbone above it. Mastoid process is going to come down our jaw. Can have a nice little shape, angle, and then down. So in this case, and in this portion, we just really want to focus on the back and the mastoid process. Now you can see roughly the halfway point and where the zygomatic bone is. And we're just going to pull our mastoid process a little bit below that with the clay brush. I'm not going to make any major changes beyond that. I'm just really going to take this and pull this down. And then wherever that mastoid process is, I'm going to start to think about a diagonal line heading straight out. This is going to be really important for me because now I need to start to define some really simple but important to deal with plane changes here in the back of the head. So again, we're going to be pulling out, thinking about the occipital bone, and this division, this line I've drawn really corresponds to some extent with the difference between the occipital bone and the parietal bone. What I really want to make sure that we're aware of is what's known as the nuchal line. Well, really they call it the superior nuchal line because there's an inferior. So that's important to keep in mind. And I'm going to take that a little bit below. This is where we're going to get a plane change from the upper portion down and in, where we're going to also meet the inferior nuchal line. You want to know about the superior nuchal line because this is where the trapezius is going to be inserting into the skull. So that's kind of an important note to keep in mind. But for me, right now, I'm going to do lines the same way I do all the other lines. I'm just going to use, just like the temporal line, I'm going to use trim dynamic to start to establish it. So I've established the superior, now I'm establishing the inferior, and I'm just filling up the space between here. We pushed in a little too far. Use trim front to just cut that off. Love that brush. And so I'm taking that mastoid process, taking it all the way back, and we're going to do the same thing yeah, there we go. Let's just get that a little cleaner and straighter. Then I'll use the move brush to just make sure it's got some dominance. Okay, so the angle we're talking about here with the nuchal line, the angle, the degree, so that's about a 90, a 45. So we're talking about a 30-degree angle Lot of room for variance there. I'm just giving you a rough estimate. Very rough. Okay, I'm going to keep that line alone. I'm not going to move that again. But I am going to adjust some shapes here because I need to have a little bit of extra form here for where the spine is going to attach to the skull. And we can pull, yeah, about like that. Okay. So we have taken the nuchal, superior nuchal line. It's a 30-degree rotation. We have taken an inferior nuchal line, and we've just matched a fairly simple plane change, and then made sure to indicate just, this is very spherical in nature, it doesn't have to be anything special, but just an area where the spine can come in and insert into our skull. From a side view, that's going to be a little bit more, you want to be thinking along right about there, I would say. The jaw is where it's going to start. We're going to come in a little bit. The spine is going to come out. Ribs, all of that stuff. Trapezius is going to flow downwards and backwards, start to form it. We've got our neck, all of that starting to come together. So I'm not going to adjust this too much more except for one more change that I just like to be clear on, and that is from a back view, you can separate out the mastoid process and what's known as the occipital protuberance. So this is a very special portion back here, this little notch. You see it more on men, of course, but let's just make sure it's a little bit more obvious. Give it a side, a front, a top, and a bottom, and you suddenly have a notch. And then I'm going to separate them slightly from the mastoid, which just means I'm just creating a minor plane change. Not essential, but useful. And at this point, we're pretty much done with that upper brow. Let's turn perspective on, because if you look at the skull right now with perspective off, it's going to look wrong or too wide. Turn perspective on, and it's looking okay. Check your halfway points for where you think the eye should be. We're within range. Cheek could get pushed back a bit. One thing you'll notice about the cheek the way it was, pretty straight up and down. Sure, that works. It's usually more in an Asian face. We're going to move it back, kind of holding a Caucasian, European standard. We don't have to go too far back, just a little bit, just like that. Small units, about a 15 to 20 degrees slope backwards. Get the orbit of the eye going backwards in space. Okay. May want to push that brow back. Something you can really see from a 3/4 view. See how far ahead that brow is. That's fine for some characters, but I am going to now slope that backwards. We built it up a little too much when we built the overhang. I used too much clay build up there to get that in effect. Okay, and then just replane a few items. And there we go. All right, so next in line is the jaw.